The wind moaned low across the prairie, stirring dust and dead grass like ghosts too bitter to rest. Josie Bell's dress clung to her legs, damp with sweat and fear. Her hands, small and calloused, trembled as she gripped the coarse fabric of her apron. She kept her eyes fixed on the broken earth beneath her boots. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Beside her, her father adjusted the brim of his worn-out hat, eyes twitching toward the horizon. His knuckles were swollen, skin dry and cracked from years of hard whiskey and harder luck. He cleared his throat like a man trying to cough up his shame. A wagon rolled over the ridge, pulled by two sway-backed mules. It creaked with every bounce as if even the wheels were reluctant to come. Dust trailed it like a funeral march. On the bench sat a man built like a smokehouse, wide, heavy, with a thick gut that strained his vest and cheeks bloated like dough too long risen. Boone Ketchum. He didn't smile when he stopped the wagon. He smirked. His eyes, small and greedy, took in Josie Bell like he was weighing a hog for market. 18, right? Boone's voice was syrupy and thick, southern slurred. She's got a woman's hips. That'll do. Josie Bell clenched her jaw. Her father gave a stiff nod. She's healthy. Knows how to clean, cook 10 chickens. Never been touched. Boone's boot hit the dirt with a thud. He waddled closer, smelling of tobacco and sweat and something spoiled underneath. His hand reached out, fat fingers with cracked nails, and tilted Josie Bell's chin. Her eyes flashed up just once. Defiant. That alone made him chuckle. She's got some fire. I like 'em with a little fight. Makes it last longer. Her father didn't flinch. Just held out his hand. Boone slapped a pouch of coins into his palm. It jingled heavy. Deal's a deal. Something inside Josie Bell snapped like a taut string. She took a step back. You can't do this. Her father didn't meet her eyes. Ain't got a choice. You'll be fed. You'll have a roof. Better than starvin'. Better than being bought like a mule? Boone grabbed her arm. You'll learn to be grateful. She struggled. He yanked her hard enough to make her stumble. Her father looked away like maybe if he didn't watch, it wasn't real. The wagon groaned again as Boone hoisted her up like luggage. She didn't scream. Wouldn't. She sat stiff and silent, hands clenched in her lap as the rancher climbed beside her, reins in one hand, his other resting on his gun like a warning. Her father stayed behind, counting coins. The prairie rolled by slow and cruel. Dry brush, buzzards circling something dead in the distance. The sun sat low, bleeding orange across the sky. Boone said nothing. Just whistled a slow, ugly tune between his teeth. They passed a ridge where a lone rider sat, still as stone, horse black as sin. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of a wide hat, but Josie Bell felt his eyes. Watching. Measuring. Boone spat toward the dirt. Stray cowpoke. They come and go. Don't matter. But Josie Bell's heart caught in her throat. That man hadn't just been there, he'd chosen to stay. To see. She didn't know why, but something in her gut twisted, and for the first time since she'd been sold, she felt something that almost tasted like hope. The ranch loomed like a scar on the land, gray wood, sun-warped and splintered, sagging under the weight of neglect. The hog pens were overgrown and the barn doors swung on rusted hinges. A pair of half-starved dogs barked weakly from under the porch. Boone pulled the wagon to a halt and clapped his belly. Home sweet hell. She didn't move. He yanked her down and pushed her toward the house. Don't go getting ideas. You're mine now. That means you do what I say when I say it and how I say it. Inside, the house stank of grease and loneliness. A skillet of something burnt sat cold on the stove. Dirty clothes littered the floor. The only sign of preparation was a cot with fresh sheets in the corner, her new prison. That night, she lay stiff under a scratchy wool blanket, eyes open in the dark. Her face throbbed where he'd backhanded her for refusing to cook. She didn't cry. Crying would make it real. Instead, she whispered to herself, "My name is Josie Bell Langley. I ain't nobody's thing. I ain't his." The next morning, the sky was gray and low, thunder rolling in the distance like distant drums. Boone stormed in drunk, shouting for eggs and bacon. She did what she was told, quiet, watching his every move like a snake watches a boot. Outside, she fed the pigs, milked the lone goat, scrubbed the floor with her sleeves rolled to her elbows. She worked without rest. He grunted approval. Maybe you'll earn your keep after all. She stole moments, on the porch, beneath the clothesline, or while hanging laundry, to scan the horizon. No sign of the man on the ridge. Maybe she'd imagined him. But one evening, just as the sun kissed the hills and the sky burned red, she heard hoofbeats. Boone was asleep in his chair, snoring like a sawmill. Josie Bell stepped out, heart hammering. The cowboy was back. He rode slow, reins loose in one hand. A rifle was slung across his back. Dust clung to his coat. He stopped at the gate and tipped his hat. Boone jerked awake and stumbled outside, gun already in hand. "Who the hell are you?" The cowboy didn't flinch. "Name's Elijah. Heard you had horses. Looking to buy." Boone scowled. "I don't sell." "Trade then." He looked at Josie Bell. Elijah's eyes followed, quiet and unreadable. Boone huffed. "She's mine." "I asked about horses." They stared. Silence stretched like a drawn bowstring. Then Boone laughed, loud and cruel. "You got grit, I'll give you that. Got coin too." Josie Bell stood rooted. Her hands were trembling again, but not from fear. Something else. Something wild. Elijah tied his horse and stepped down. Josie Bell noticed the dust on his boots, the way he moved, like a man who'd fought too many fights and won just enough to keep going. Over supper, Boone bragged, spat tobacco, and slurred half-truths. Elijah listened. Didn't say much. Just watched. Watched her. That night, Josie Bell sat in the dark again. The wind howled outside. She touched the bruise on her cheek and whispered, "He saw me. He saw me." And out there in the blackness, on the edge of the ranch, a man named Elijah stood watch. He wasn't sure yet why he'd stayed. But she was. Because sometimes, even in a land this cruel, a quiet shadow could mean the difference between being owned and being free. The morning after Elijah came and left, Josie Bell scrubbed the porch steps until her fingers bled. Boone had been in a foul mood, jealous, suspicious. He didn't like the way the cowboy looked at her. Or maybe it was how Josie Bell had looked back. Boone wasn't a smart man, but he wasn't blind either. Something had shifted, and he could feel it like a storm brewing on the edge of his land. "You keep your eyes down when there's company," he growled, flinging a pan across the floor when breakfast was too cold for his liking. "Ain't no one interested in a girl with bruises and sass." Josie Bell kept quiet. She'd learned early when to speak, when to duck, and when to stare at the wall like it could open up and swallow her whole. Still, she never stopped watching the horizon. Each day was a copy of the last, gray, long, and stifling. The chores were endless. Boone reeked of whiskey and sweat. At night, he snored through the walls, and Josie Bell stared at the ceiling, whispering her name to herself so she wouldn't forget it. But she found a strange sort of companionship in a mutt named Whiskey, an old ranch dog with one ear and a limp. He followed her from pen to coop to well. Sometimes she talked to him. "Reckon you been here longer than me," she murmured one day, brushing his matted coat. "Ever think about biting him in his sleep?" Whiskey thumped his tail. "I'll bake you a pie if you do." Boone, meanwhile, was still talking about Elijah days after he'd gone. "Cowboys like that don't stick around," he said, polishing his gun at the kitchen table. "Think they're better than the rest of us. All quiet, all noble. Ain't nothing noble about the trail. It makes bastards out of everyone." Josie Bell said nothing, but she held on to Boone's words. Because a week later, Elijah came back. This time, he didn't stop at the gate. He rode straight up to the porch. "I'll work for feed and a dry place to sleep," Elijah said, his voice low and even. 3 weeks. Then I move on." Boone eyed him suspiciously, but agreed one out. "Fine. The barn's yours. You muck the stalls, fix the fencing, and keep your eyes off my woman. I'm not here for trouble." That better be true. From the barn window, Elijah could see her hanging laundry. Her sleeves were rolled high, bruises painting her arms like ink. She moved like someone twice her age, tired, practiced, but never fully beaten. He fixed fences, chopped wood, repaired a squealing door Boone had ignored for years. And Josie Bell watched him, always from a distance, always careful. They didn't speak much, not at first. But their silences held more meaning than most people's words. One evening, Josie Bell brought out water in a tin cup. "You'll get blisters swinging that axe wrong," she said, nodding to his hands. "I've had worse. Still, no good if you can't lift your arms come winter." He took the cup. "Thanks." She didn't leave. He didn't ask her to. "I had a brother once," she said, eyes on the setting sun. "He ran off to join the army when I was 10. Sent one letter. Died in some war I never understood." Elijah nodded. "I had a sister. She married a man who used his fists when words failed. By the time I got there, he buried her behind the barn. Said she slipped on the steps." Her hand tightened around her apron. "Did he?" "No." They didn't speak again for days. But something had settled between them, something raw and honest, born from pain they didn't have to explain. Boone took notice. He drank more. Grew louder. slammed doors. One night, he accused Josie Bell of offering herself to Elijah. You think I don't see it? That look in your eye when he walks past. There's nothing to see, Josie Bell said quietly. He raised a hand. Elijah was on the porch before it fell. Boone turned with a sneer. You think you're some kind of hero? Back off, cowboy. She's mine. I'm not here for your woman, Elijah said, voice calm. I'm here for the horses. The work. Then stick to it. Later that night, Josie Bell sat behind the chicken coop, hugging her knees. Her lip was split. Her pride worse. Elijah found her there, holding an old kerchief to her mouth. Should have stayed gone, she whispered. I couldn't. You gonna fight him next time? Only if you ask me to. She looked up. And if I don't? Then I wait. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. That's stupid. Maybe. But it's your call. He handed her a small pocket knife. Keep it. Just in case. She took it. Her fingers lingered on his. The next few days passed with a quiet hum of tension. Boone was quieter, watching them like a snake. Elijah slept light, hand always near his belt. Josie Bell moved through each day like someone walking across ice, careful, ready for it to crack. One afternoon, while drawing water, Josie Bell turned to find Boone standing right behind her. His breath reeked. You think I don't know? He hissed. You think I ain't seen the way he looks at you? She stepped back. You forget who bought you. I remember, she said softly. Every day. He lunged. She stabbed. The little knife tore a shallow line across his forearm. Boone roared, grabbed her by the hair, and dragged her screaming into the house. Elijah heard it all. By the time he got inside, Boone had locked her in the cellar. You got no say in this, Boone slurred, waving a pistol. You're lucky I don't put a bullet in you too. But Elijah wasn't listening anymore. He turned and walked out. Not away but toward the barn. The rain came hard that night. Thunder cracked like gunfire across the prairie. The wind howled, slamming shutters. In the cellar, Josie Bell sat in the dark, hugging whiskey for warmth. Water pooled beneath the door. The smell of mold and old roots filled her nose. Above her, footsteps. The door creaked. Elijah? Back up. She did. The door burst open. A hand reached down. When she stepped out into the storm, he was already loading Boone's pistol. He pressed it into her palm. You sure? She looked down at the gun. Then at the door. No, she said. But I won't be locked up again. They waited. Boone stumbled out minutes later, shirt half open, hair plastered to his face with rain. What the hell? Josie Bell stepped forward. It's over. He froze. Put it down, he growled. She didn't. Elijah, he barked, tell her. Elijah said nothing. I'll kill you both, Boone spat. No, Josie Bell said. You won't. The thunder rolled. Boone lunged. The gun fired. The echo tore through the ranch, louder than the storm. Boone dropped to his knees. Not dead, just shot in the leg. Elijah kicked the weapon away before he could reach it. Josie Bell stood over him, breathing hard. I wasn't born for this, she whispered. But I sure as hell won't die in it. Boone howled as the rain turned red in the dirt. They left him there. Left the ranch. Left everything. Except whiskey. As they rode away under the dark clouds, Josie Bell didn't look back. Elijah rode beside her in silence. She didn't ask where they were headed. Didn't need to. The only thing she knew was this. For the first time in a long time, the road ahead was hers to choose. They rode west beneath a sky bruised with storm clouds, the wind tugging at their clothes like cold fingers. Josie Bell held the reins tighter than she needed to, not out of fear but to feel in control. For once. Elijah rode beside her, silent, watching the road but never straying far. The trail was cruel. Dry. Endless. Rattlesnakes coiled beneath rocks. Vultures circled. Water grew scarce. By the second night, Josie Bell's hands were raw and blistered from riding. Her back ached. But she never complained. They made camp by a dry creek bed. Elijah started a fire with practiced ease. Josie Bell sat across from him, whiskey curled against her legs. Where are we headed? She finally asked. Nowhere in particular, he said. Just away. She stared into the flames. That used to scare me. Still does. A little less each day. The fire cracked, throwing shadows on her face. She looked older already. Not aged but shaped. Hardened. A girl who'd been sold like livestock now held a revolver at her side and slept under the stars. Elijah handed her a canteen. We can follow the old cattle trail south. There's a town 2 days out, Dry Fork. Quiet. Might be work there. Work for you or work for me? He raised an eyebrow. I mean it, she said. I'm not looking for a hero. I've had enough men try and fix me. I'll earn my way. Just, don't try to own me. I won't, he said. And she believed him. The next morning they ran into trouble. 3 riders appeared near midday, dust-streaked, lean, with pistols low on their hips and eyes that didn't smile. They blocked the trail like they were the law, though Josie Bell saw right through it. Afternoon, the leader called, nodding at Elijah. Trail tax. Tax? Elijah asked. Yup. You're using our dirt. Gonna cost you. Elijah didn't reach for his gun. He didn't even twitch. You're outnumbered, the man warned. Josie Bell spoke up. So are you. They laughed, until they saw the fire in her eyes. The tension cracked like lightning. One rider twitched. Elijah moved faster. 2 shots. 2 men fell. The third took off, screaming through the brush. Josie Bell stood frozen, revolver in hand, though she hadn't fired. Elijah holstered his calmly, stepped to her side. You all right? She nodded. I think so. You shook. Yeah. Good. Means you're still human. They buried the body shallow, beneath thornbrush. Josie Bell didn't flinch at the sight of blood anymore. She tied her hair back and helped dig. That night they didn't make a fire. Just lay in silence under the stars, listening for hooves that never came. By the 3rd day, Dry Fork shimmered on the horizon like a mirage. Just a handful of buildings, 1 saloon, a stable, and a blacksmith shop with a busted sign. The town looked tired, like it hadn't had news in months. They stabled their horses. Elijah traded a silver ring for 2 nights in the inn above the saloon. Josie Bell didn't ask where he got it. She didn't need to know. She found work scrubbing floors and serving drinks. Elijah helped mend fences on a nearby ranch. The days passed slowly. Nights even slower. People stared. Whispered. A girl traveling alone with a man like Elijah didn't sit right with them. Too quiet. Too pretty. Too proud. But no one said it to her face. One night, a ranch hand cornered her behind the saloon. Girl, like you don't belong out here alone. She turned calm. I'm not alone. He grabbed her wrist. Don't be stupid. You could come stay with me. I got a room. You could do better. Elijah stepped from the shadows. The man laughed, raising his hands. Easy. Just talking, is all. Josie Bell's voice was ice. Talk somewhere else. The man backed off. Josie Bell turned to Elijah. You weren't gonna stop him? I was waiting to see if you wanted to stop him yourself. She blinked, then smiled. I did. They left Dry Fork 3 days later. Josie Bell had enough coin for supplies, and Elijah had a new scar along his shoulder, a gift from falling off a rickety roof while fixing the barn. She stitched it herself, cursing softly, hands steady. Most men wouldn't let a girl sew them up, she teased. Most men bleed more that way. They rode on, the land growing wilder. Hills turned to canyons. Cacti stood like silent sentries. At dusk, the sky burned violet. Coyotes howled from distant ridges. Josie Bell talked more now. Laughed sometimes. She told stories, about the time she fell into a well as a child, about her mother's cinnamon bread, about her dream of having land she could call hers. What would you do with land? Elijah asked one night. Plant peach trees. Raise chickens. Maybe teach girls how to shoot. I'd stay for that. She looked across the firelight. Would you? His silence was answer enough. Then came the fire. They camped near an abandoned homestead, stone chimney, collapsed roof, scattered tools half buried in weeds. Josie Bell liked the place. Said it had character. They made a fire, hung wet clothes to dry, even laughed over burnt beans. Then Elijah heard the horses. Riders. For maybe 5. Moving fast. Josie Bell's face turned stone cold. The one who got away. Elijah grabbed the rifle. Get to cover. But she didn't run. The men came fast, shouting, guns raised. The lead rider wore a grin and a scar down his chin. Thought you could kill my boys and vanish? He barked. Elijah fired first. The fight was chaos. Flashes of fire, screams, pounding hooves. Josie Bell shot one in the shoulder. Elijah dropped another near the well. Then the lantern spilled. Flames leapt up the side of the ruined house. Wind caught the blaze, tossing sparks like knives. The whole world turned orange in smoke. Josie Bell dragged Elijah behind the chimney. He was bleeding, grazed bad in the thigh. She tore her sleeve, tied the wound, and stood guard while he loaded a fresh round. The last man tried to sneak up from the rear. Josie Bell caught him. One shot. Silence. The fire raged behind them, lighting the night like judgment. Josie Bell stood alone in the glow, smoke curling through her hair, pistol still warm in her grip. She looked like a legend. Later, when the fire died to embers, they sat side by side in the ashes. Elijah winced as he shifted. "You okay?" she asked. "I'll live." "You always say that." He looked at her. "You didn't run. Didn't feel like running. You saved me. You'd have done the same." They didn't speak for a while. The stars overhead were sharp and cold. "I used to think I'd die in a house like that," she said, nodding at the smoldering ruins. "Chained to someone like Boone. Screaming where no one could hear me. And now," she turned to him, "now I'm the one holding the gun." And for the first time Elijah smiled. Not a flicker. A real one. Because she wasn't the girl he'd met on that porch anymore. She was something else now. Something forged. A survivor. They lay beside the dying fire, the scent of smoke and blood around them. Whiskey snored at their feet. Elijah dozed. Josie Bell stayed awake, watching the embers dance. She wasn't afraid of the trail ahead. Not anymore. By the time they reached the Rio Piedra, Josie Bell had learned the rhythm of the trail. When to ride slow, when to let the horse drink, how to feel weather changing in her bones before it ever showed in the sky. She'd stopped flinching at sudden sounds. Stopped asking for permission to speak. She had her own saddle now, a pistol that felt like part of her hand, and a name that rolled off her tongue like thunder. Josie Bell Langley. Not anyone's daughter. Not anyone's wife. Just her. Elijah healed slower than he let on. His limp was worse after long days in the saddle, but he never complained. Josie Bell noticed, though. She started scouting ahead more, taking the lead without asking. Sometimes he'd smile and let her. Other times he'd challenge her. Either way, he never made her feel small. Their trail curved south toward the borderlands, open country where the law wore a different face depending on the town. They stopped in Rosita for supplies. A dusty, wind-bitten place with a saloon and a church standing across from each other like two old enemies. Josie Bell traded a rabbit pelt for a proper belt holster. Elijah got whiskey and bullets. The shopkeep gave them both odd looks, especially her. "You ride with him?" he asked, squinting. "I ride for myself. Not many girls do. I'm not many girls." They left at dawn, headed toward the flats. Just as the hills turned blue in the distance, they came upon it, a ranch in ruins. Burned fence posts. Scattered bones. Wind howling through an empty cabin frame. Josie Bell dismounted without a word, eyes fixed. "Boone's place," she whispered. They'd made a wide loop. Unintentionally. Or maybe not. Elijah stayed behind, letting her walk it alone. Josie Bell stepped over blackened timber and into what used to be the living room. The cot was gone. The walls were gone. But the memory remained. Her voice echoed in the silence. "I thought this was the end of my story," she murmured. "Turns out it was the start." She found the iron ring Boone used to bolt the cellar shut, half buried in dirt. Pulled it free, tossed it into the fire pit with a hiss. Elijah finally spoke. "He ain't here anymore. But ghosts don't stay gone unless you send them off." "I'm not afraid of ghosts," Josie Bell said. "I carry worse inside me." That night they camped a mile out, where prairie met pine. Josie Bell sat sharpening her knife, staring into the fire. "You ever think about stopping?" she asked. "Stopping what?" "The road. The fighting. Just having something quiet." "All the time," Elijah said. "But I don't know what quiet looks like anymore." Josie Bell stared into the flames. "I do. It's a porch with creaky steps, peach trees out back, chickens running wild. And a shotgun by the door just in case." He looked at her, long and thoughtful. "You think I fit in that picture? I think you'd build the steps." In the dark, their hands found each other. No promises. Just warmth. By morning there were tracks in the dust. Fresh. Wagon wheels headed east. Too clean to be traitors. Elijah knelt, studying them. "Military?" "No," Josie Bell said, crouching beside him. "Too fast. Too deep. Bounty hunters." "They after us?" She shook her head. "Not yet. But they're close." They rode hard through the flats, sleeping only in shifts. By the second night they caught up. The bounty hunters had set camp in a gully, smoke trailing lazy into the air. Josie Bell and Elijah crept close, watched from the rocks above. 7 men. Armed. Drinking. One had a poster in his hand. Josie Bell narrowed her eyes. "That's me." Elijah looked. The sketch was crude, but it bore her name. Josie Bell Langley. Wanted for the attempted murder of Boone Ketchum. She exhaled slow. "He lived." Elijah's jaw clenched. He lied to the sheriff. Flipped the story. Of course he did. Still want to run? Josie Bell didn't answer. She stood. No. I want to finish it. They waited for nightfall. When the last fire burned low and laughter faded, they moved in, quick, quiet. Josie Bell's heart pounded, but her hands were steady. One man got up to piss. Elijah took him down with the butt of his rifle. Another woke too soon. Josie Bell shot him before he could scream. The camp exploded in chaos. Gunfire lit the dark. Sparks flew. One hunter grabbed Josie Bell from behind. She drove her elbow into his gut, spun, and fired into his chest. Elijah took 2 bullets but stayed on his feet, bleeding, relentless. The last hunter threw down his gun, begging for mercy. Josie Bell stepped forward, blood on her face, boots soaked in dust. Who sent you? Letter came from Boone, the man stammered. Said you were dangerous. Said you ran with a killer. She leveled her revolver at his forehead. Elijah touched her arm. He's done. She held his gaze. Then lowered the gun. They left the man sobbing in the dirt. Took supplies, burned the rest. Elijah collapsed by the creek. Josie Bell tended his wounds with whiskey and bandages, biting down her fear. His breath was shallow, but his eyes stayed open. You're gonna live, she whispered. I know. You better. He managed a crooked grin. Still owe you peach trees. 2 days later, they crossed the border into New Mexico territory. No lawmen. No posters. Just silence and sky. They found a bluff overlooking a river, wind rustling tall grass around them. Josie Bell stood with her hands on her hips, eyes scanning the land. This is it, she said. Right here. For what? For starting over. Elijah looked at her. You sure? She nodded. I've run enough. Time to build something. He dismounted, stood beside her. What do we build first? A porch. He laughed. She smiled. Later that evening, Josie Bell sat by the fire, notebook in hand. She didn't write much. Just a few words. Josie Bell Langley. Rancher. Shooter. Survivor. Free. The stars blinked above like they were listening. She turned to the audience, her voice low, steady. Folks will tell you the West don't care who you are. That it swallows girls like me whole. But I spit it right back. I bled, I broke, I burned, and I came through standing. The wind picked up, carrying her words. And if you're out there lost, thinking no one sees you, remember this. The trail don't own you. The scars don't define you. And sometimes the quietest cowboy carries the loudest storm. Behind her, Elijah stirred, still breathing. Still alive. And beside him, Josie Bell Langley faced the dawn. Unbroken. The snow came down in slow, heavy curtains, draping the world in a hush so thick even the whistle of the arriving train sounded muted, distant, like a memory. The iron beast hissed and groaned against the cold as it pulled into the desolate station, its windows fogged, its passengers bundled and weary. In the last car, beneath a battered carpetbag in trembling hands, sat Pearl Hart, a slip of a girl dressed in white lace, out of place in this gray and brutal world. She rose when the train shuddered to a stop, gathering her courage the way a soldier might gather his sword, and stepped down onto the platform. The instant her boots touched the wood, a fierce gust of wind snatched at her veil, pulling it like a ghost toward the endless pale fields beyond. She clutched it to her chest, glancing about the empty station with wide, searching eyes. There were only a few souls braving the storm. Ranchers in thick coats, mothers pulling their children along, a couple of hired men shoving crates. But none who seemed to be looking for her. None who wore the face she had memorized from the photograph mailed months ago with trembling, hopeful words. The cross at her neck glinted dully, a stark line against the fine lace of her bodice. She touched it, grounding herself, remembering Mama's hand pressing it into hers the night before she left, whispering prayers meant to follow her across every mile of this rough country. Snow gathered at her hem and tangled in her hair as she turned, searching again, her heart beating a frantic rhythm. At last, from the far side of the platform, a tall man in a dusty hat pushed through the swirling snow. He moved with purpose, boots striking the boards hard enough to sound over the storm. Martin Kane. The name that had filled pages of letters and dreams. The man who promised steady land, a warm house, a chance at something like a life. He stopped a few feet from her, eyes raking over her figure with a scowl. His face was handsome in the way of carved stone, sharp, cold, unyielding. Pearl Hart offered a small, nervous smile, reaching into her cloak to retrieve the final letter he had sent, the one that promised he would know her by the silver cross she wore. But Martin's gaze had already caught on it. The cross. His mouth twisted. He didn't reach for the letter. Didn't offer a greeting. "You one of them Bible women?" he said, voice cutting the air sharper than the wind. Pearl Hart's fingers tightened on the letter. She swallowed hard, willing herself steady. "Only my mama's faith, sir. She asked me to keep it close." Martin snorted, a sound of contempt more than humor. He looked her up and down again, finding fault in the dirt clinging to the hem of her dress, the raw pink of her cheeks, the thinness of her arms. "I ain't looking to be preached at in my own home," he said, pulling his coat tighter around him. "Nor to have a wife who spends more time on her knees praying than tending to what needs doing." Pearl Hart's heart cracked then, a hairline fracture, invisible but deep. She opened her mouth, searching for words, but found none. Martin tipped his hat back just enough to show her the finality in his eyes. "Find yourself another fool," he said. "Ain't no place for piety on my land." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and strode back the way he had come, disappearing into the snow as if he had never been there at all. For a long moment, Pearl Hart stood frozen, the rejected letter wilting in her hand, the cold sinking teeth into her bones. Around her, life moved on. The stationmaster's lantern swung on its hook. The hired men cursed as they wrangled crates. The train huffed and prepared to leave again, carrying away the last familiar piece of her old life. She was alone. Utterly and without recourse. A small, stooped man in a thick scarf approached her then, his face crinkled with sympathy. "Miss," he said, voice rough with years and winter. "You're welcome to sit a spell in the office. There's a stove. I can't offer much, but better than standing here freezing your soul out." Pearl Hart nodded numbly, letting him guide her toward a narrow door tucked into the station wall. Inside, the world was a little warmer, the small cast-iron stove popping and hissing as it battled the cold seeping in through every crack. She sank onto a wooden bench, pulling her carpet bag close, feeling the sting of rejection settle into her marrow. Tears threatened but did not fall. She wouldn't give the storm the satisfaction. The old station master bustled about, tending the fire and muttering to himself. He left a mug of weak coffee on a nearby crate, a small kindness Pearl Hart couldn't yet bring herself to accept. Outside, the snow thickened, blurring the outlines of the world. She watched it swirl and dance through the grimy window pane, feeling herself growing smaller with every passing minute, shrinking into a thing forgotten by time and mercy. Somewhere in the distance, a telegraph tapped out a lonely, stuttering message, its meaning lost beneath the storm's howling chorus. The door creaked open again, letting in a fresh gust of bitter air. Pearl Hart didn't turn immediately. She didn't want to see another set of indifferent eyes passing judgment on her. But something about the presence lingering at the threshold pulled at her, gentle and persistent as a memory of summer. She glanced over her shoulder. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy oilskin coat dusted with snow. His hat was pulled low, his face shadowed, but his posture spoke of a different kind of strength, one not sharpened into cruelty by the world, but hardened into something patient and unyielding. He spoke briefly with the station master, his voice low and steady, the words inaudible to Pearl Hart over the crackling of the stove. Then his gaze turned to her. Not to her dress, not to her cross, not to the pitiful carpetbag at her feet. To her, the woman beneath it all. For a long moment they simply looked at one another across the dim room, the storm raging outside and something quieter, deeper stirring between them. The man gave a small nod, a gesture that somehow asked permission rather than demanded anything. Pearl Hart, trembling though she was, found herself lifting her chin a fraction, granting it. He crossed the room in slow, sure steps, kneeling beside her bench so they were eye level. Up close, his face was lined and rough, the beard shadowing his jaw speckled with gray. His eyes were the color of the river stones Pearl Hart used to skip as a child, deep, enduring, ancient. He didn't offer a name. Didn't ask for hers. Didn't reach out as Martin had to seize and measure. Instead, he said softly, in a voice like worn leather and campfire smoke, "You got anywhere to go, miss?" Pearl Hart shook her head, the motion small, almost invisible. The man nodded again as if he had expected nothing different. "My place is not far," he said, gaze steady. "Warm. Safe. If you've got nowhere else." He didn't smile. Didn't promise. Only offered. Pearl Hart looked down at her hands, raw and red from the cold, the silver cross catching a stray beam of lamplight. Was it foolish to trust a stranger? Perhaps. But it seemed far more foolish to sit here waiting for salvation that had already turned its back on her. She rose slowly, gathering her bag in her tattered pride. The man stood as well, offering his arm in the old-fashioned way, crook bent and hand steady. Pearl Heart hesitated, then slid her hand into the crook of his elbow. Outside, the snow roared against the earth, but within the small circle of warmth they carried between them, Pearl Heart felt, for the first time in what felt like years, that maybe she was not meant to weather this storm alone. They stepped into the blizzard together, the station fading into a blur behind them, the path ahead vanishing into white unknown. Pearl Heart did not know where this road would lead. Only that, for now, she would walk it. And that, for the first time in too long, was enough. The wind tore at them like angry hands as they stepped away from the dim safety of the station. But the man's presence beside Pearl Heart was a steadying weight against the fury of the storm. His horse stood tethered nearby, a big chestnut with a white blaze down its nose, steam curling from its nostrils as it stamped impatiently at the frozen ground. He said little as he helped Pearl Heart onto the saddle, lifting her with surprising gentleness, as if he feared she might shatter beneath his touch. Then he swung up behind her, the horse shifting under their combined weight, and wrapped one strong arm around her waist to steady her. The warmth of him, the simple living warmth of another soul, seeped through the layers of her coat and dress, thawing something inside her that had been locked in ice. They moved out into the white wasteland, the snow swallowing the world until it felt like they floated between heaven and earth, alone in a place without borders or time. The man kept the horse at a careful, steady pace, his other hand loose but sure on the reins. Now and then he leaned closer, his breath stirring the hair at Pearl Heart's temple, to murmur directions to the animal, low and calm. Time stretched and folded in the storm. Pearl Heart's fingers grew numb where they clutched the saddle horn. Her eyelids grew heavy, weighed down by cold and exhaustion. She might have slipped into sleep, might have fallen entirely into the storm's mercy, if not for the occasional squeeze of the man's hand against her side, anchoring her to the present. At last, after what felt like a lifetime adrift, a dark shape emerged from the endless white. A squat cabin, its roof bowed under a heavy burden of snow, smoke limping from a bent stovepipe. The man brought the horse to a halt before the small porch and dismounted in one fluid motion. He turned, lifting Pearl Heart down with the same quiet care he had shown before, setting her lightly on the frozen ground. Her knees wobbled, and for a moment she leaned into him, the roughness of his coat scraping her cheek, the steady thud of his heart a drumbeat of survival. Without a word, he guided her up the 3 creaking steps and pushed open the door. Warmth hit her like a wave. Real, living heat, radiating from a cast-iron stove in the center of the single-room cabin. The walls were lined with rough-hewn shelves, books jammed in every available space, tins of coffee and beans stacked neatly beside a worn, scarred table. The man removed his coat and shook the snow from it, hanging it by the door before turning back to her. His hair was damp and curling slightly at the ends, his beard dusted with melted snowflakes. He didn't smile, but there was a softness to his expression, a kind of patient expectation. Pearl Heart stood trembling in the entryway, unsure what to do, unsure what was expected. In her old life, she would have been expected to wait for instructions, to shrink herself small enough to fit into whatever mold was offered. Instead, she moved forward on her own, peeling off her sodden gloves, removing her cloak, revealing the simple white dress beneath. The man's eyes flickered briefly to the cross at her throat, but there was no judgment there. Only recognition. As if he had seen such burdens before and understood the weight they carried. He gestured to a chair near the stove, and Pearl Heart sank into it gratefully, stretching her frozen fingers toward the blessed heat. "I'll see to the horse," he said, voice still that low, steady rumble that seemed more a part of the storm than separate from it. Pearl Heart watched him through the frosted window as he moved with methodical efficiency, unsaddling the horse, leading it to a small lean-to stable half hidden by snowdrifts. He brushed the animal down, spoke to it in soft tones, treated it like a companion rather than a tool. When he returned, stomping snow from his boots, Pearl Heart had thought enough to notice her surroundings more fully. A battered Bible sat on the table, its cover worn thin by use. A rifle rested in the corner, polished but unthreatening. Above the stove, a string of drying herbs lent the air a faint, earthy fragrance. The man set about making coffee, his movements sure and practiced. He filled a tin pot with water from a barrel near the door, measured out grounds with a wooden scoop, set the pot on the stove to boil. The simple rhythmic task seemed to ground the cabin, to knit the frayed edges of the world back together. Pearl Heart watched him, her mind turning over the strangeness of it all. She should have been terrified. She was alone with a stranger, miles from anyone who might hear a scream. But instead of fear, she felt an odd, cautious peace. As if she had stumbled not into danger, but into the eye of a storm. He poured 2 tin mugs of coffee and brought one to her, setting it carefully on the table within easy reach. Then he pulled up another chair and sat across from her, cradling his own mug between calloused hands. For a while they simply sat, the only sounds the pop of the fire and the whisper of the storm outside. At last he spoke. "Name's Eli Ramsey," he said, voice rough but kind. Pearl Hart's own name caught in her throat, but she managed to find it. "Pearl Hart," she whispered. Eli nodded, as if the exchange of names was all that needed to be said. As if names themselves were a kind of vow, binding them to a shared understanding. He didn't ask what had brought her here, or why she wore a wedding dress under her heavy cloak. He didn't pry. He simply accepted her presence, the way the cabin accepted the snow piling against its walls. The coffee was bitter but hot, and Pearl Hart drank it gratefully, feeling life creep back into her frozen limbs. Eli rose again after a time, setting a battered pot of beans on the stove. He moved with a quiet grace, every action purposeful, unhurried. Pearl Hart offered to help, but he shook his head, his eyes warm and firm. "Rest," he said simply. She obeyed, too weary to argue. Night fell early in the storm. Darkness pressed against the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and piling snow higher against the door. Eli set out a bedroll for himself near the fire, spreading thick quilts over it. For Pearl Hart, he gestured toward the narrow cot tucked against the far wall, piled high with homespun blankets. She hesitated again, the old instincts flaring. Fear, distrust, the knowledge of how easily kindness could twist into cruelty. But Eli made no move toward her. No demand, no expectation. He simply settled onto his bedroll, tugged a quilt over himself, and closed his eyes. Pearl Hart changed out of her wet dress as best she could behind the scant cover of a hanging blanket, slipping into a flannel nightgown she had packed in her carpetbag. She burrowed into the cot, pulling the blankets up to her chin, the smell of wood smoke and pine filling her lungs. Sleep should have come easily, but her mind churned, replaying the humiliation at the station. The cold finality of Martin Kane's rejection. Tears welled and slipped down her cheeks, silent and hot against the frozen numbness that had claimed her for so long. She wept for her father, for her mother, for the life that had led her to a strange man's cabin on the edge of the world. She wept for the pieces of herself she had lost along the way. And in the quiet between sobs she heard a soft shuffling sound. A quilt landing gently at the foot of her cot. Eli's voice, low and careful in the dark. "Snow's colder than most reckon," he said. "Thought you might could use another." She didn't answer, couldn't trust her voice not to betray her. But she pulled the extra quilt up over herself, burying her face in its rough, comforting warmth. The storm raged outside, battering the cabin, the world beyond reduced to chaos and fury. But inside the fire burned steady. And within her a tiny, stubborn ember flickered to life, refusing to be extinguished. She slept, finally, not because she had given up, but because for the first time in a long while, she believed she might wake to something better. The last thing she saw before dreams claimed her was the silver cross glinting faintly in the firelight, resting just above her heart. And somewhere deep inside she dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, someone saw her worth, not in spite of that cross but because of it. The days blurred into one another, stitched together by the steady rhythm of the storm and the quiet pulse of survival. Morning brought pale gray light and the endless whisper of snow against the cabin walls. Evening folded the world into darkness again, wrapping it in deep, frozen silence. Pearl Hart learned the cabin's language in small, careful steps. How the floorboards creaked just before the stove needed more wood. How the kettle whistled low and tired when the water was ready. How Eli's footsteps, slow and deliberate, carried a different kind of warmth than the fire ever could. They spoke little at first. Not from discomfort but from a shared reverence for the quiet. Words were rationed like sugar or kerosene, used only when necessary, each one carrying weight and meaning. When Eli taught Pearl Hart how to split kindling, he showed her with his own hands first, not just instructions but an invitation. He placed the hatchet in her grip, his large hand steadying hers just long enough for her to feel the right balance, the right tension. Then he stepped back, letting her try, trusting her strength without coddling her weakness. The first log cracked under her swing, splitting cleanly, and Eli offered a nod that felt more valuable than any spoken praise. In return, Pearl Hart mended one of his shirts by lamplight, stitching neat rows along a tear that had frayed from years of work and weather. Her fingers found their rhythm as she sat at the table, the silver needle flashing in the firelight, and for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, she felt useful, needed, capable. One evening, as the storm's fury waned to a soft, constant snowfall, Eli rummaged through a battered box tucked beneath his bed and pulled out a small worn pouch. Inside he found a delicate pair of pliers and a coil of fine wire. He knelt before Pearl Heart where she sat by the hearth, cradling her cross necklace between his calloused fingers. "Clasps near broken," he said simply. She nodded, unable to find her voice. With a patience that spoke of long practice with small stubborn things, Eli worked the wire through the broken links, mending the fragile chain. His brows furrowed in concentration, and Pearl Heart watched the way his rough hands moved so carefully, as if the cross were something sacred. When he finished, he looped the necklace gently around her neck again, the metal cool against her skin, the weight familiar and comforting. For a long moment they stayed like that, her sitting, him kneeling, the space between them pulsing with something neither of them dared name. Outside, the snow thickened again, soft as a lullaby. Days later, as the world slowly shifted from blinding white to muted gray, Eli hitched up the horse and sled, preparing for a supply run into town. Pearl Heart bundled herself in every spare layer she could find and insisted on coming along. The journey was slow, the road half buried, but together they carved a path through it, side by side. Eli offered her the reins once they reached flatter ground, guiding her hands as she learned the feel of the horse's gait through leather and wood. It was in town, under the wary gazes of neighbors and strangers alike, that Pearl Heart realized how far she had traveled, not just across miles, but across the barren plains of her own heart. Eli walked beside her as they bartered for flour and coffee, never once stepping ahead of her, never shielding her from the world or thrusting her into it. He stood with her. Not for her. Not despite her. With her. At the general store, a neighbor family bustled in, melting the chill from the air with their noisy warmth. Mrs. Harper, a woman with broad hips and a ready laugh, swept Pearl Heart into a brief but fierce embrace, chattering about barn dances and quilting bees and the upcoming spring fair. It was the life Pearl Heart had once dreamed of: community, connection, belonging. As she watched the Harpers tease each other and share news of neighbors lost and found, she realized that longing still lived within her, stubborn as spring beneath the snow. Eli caught her looking and offered a small, knowing smile. "Good folks," he said. Pearl Heart nodded, her heart aching with the sudden, fierce hope that maybe she could find a place among them. That maybe she was not too strange, too bruised, too burdened to belong. The trip back to the cabin was quieter but not heavy. A kind of contented silence stretched between them, filled with the promise of new beginnings. That night, Pearl Heart stood outside while Eli banked the fire, the vast sweep of sky overhead a deep velvet blue, pricked with distant stars. The snow had finally eased into a gentle drift, soft and constant, wrapping the world in delicate white. She lifted her face to the sky, letting the cold kiss her cheeks, feeling small and infinite all at once. Eli joined her after a moment, his presence a warm, solid weight beside her. They stood there for a long time, saying nothing, breathing in the same frozen air, bound together by something deeper than words. At last Pearl Heart spoke, her voice no more than a breath. "I thought I was coming here to find a life," she said, the truth unwinding from her chest like a thread. "To build something. To start again." Eli said nothing, only waited. "But it feels like—" she faltered, then found her courage. "It feels like I was meant to find myself." Eli reached out, slow and deliberate, and took her hand in his. His palm was rough, lined with work and loss and living, but it closed around hers with a gentleness that stole her breath. "You ain't lost," he said quietly, his words sinking into her bones like the heat of the stove after a long day in the cold. "You're right here." Pearl Heart turned to him, searching his face for doubt or pity or false hope, but found none. Only steady, unwavering truth. He saw her, the battered places, the tender places, the strength she had hidden even from herself. And somehow, impossibly, he honored all of it. The firelight flickered through the window, casting their shadows long across the snow. Pearl Heart squeezed his hand, grounding herself in the solid, living reality of it all. They were two broken things, battered by life and loss and loneliness, standing together beneath the endless, frozen sky. And in that moment, Pearl Heart realized something so simple and profound it stole the cold right out of her bones. Home was not a place. Home was a hand held steady in the dark. Home was trust, offered freely and without expectation. Home was someone who saw your broken pieces and chose to stay. The snow whispered around them, weaving their shadows tighter, binding them not with chains, but with the fragile, unbreakable threads of hope. Pearl Heart leaned into Eli, resting her head against his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heart beneath her cheek. And for the first time in her life, she let herself believe that she was enough. Not because someone had claimed her. Not because she had proven her worth. But simply because she was. The world beyond the cabin was still cold, still brutal, still uncertain. But within that small, hard-won circle of warmth, Pearl Hart and Eli stood together. And together they would weather whatever storms came next. The snow began to melt in slow, stubborn patches, pulling the land from its long white sleep. Ice broke free from the edges of the roof in sharp, sudden cracks, and the muddy paths that had once been roads began to reappear, slick and treacherous but full of promise. Life stirred in the world again, tentative and raw. Inside the cabin, a new rhythm took hold. Pearl Hart rose early, tending the fire and mending clothes, humming soft hymns under her breath. Eli spent hours outside, repairing the fence, chopping wood, whistling tunes no one else seemed to know. There was comfort in the simple, steady work, in the way their lives wove together without need for grand Pearl Hartians. Still, the thaw brought more than just renewal. It carried reminders, too, of what had been lost and what still waited to be faced beyond the safe cocoon they had built. It was Pearl Hart who first suggested the trip into town, her voice steady but her hands betraying a tremble she couldn't quite hide. Supplies were low, true enough, but more than that, there was a part of her that needed to walk back into the world she had once been cast out of. To stand upright where she had once been left to sink into the snow. Eli watched her closely when she spoke, weighing something behind those riverstone eyes. Then he nodded, the barest dip of his chin, and began saddling the horse. The ride was easier than before, the snow giving way to thick, clinging mud. The sky overhead was a patchwork of blue and gray, the sun struggling to break free of winter's lingering grip. They traveled side by side, not speaking much, but sharing glances, small smiles, a language more honest than anything that could be said aloud. When the town came into view, Pearl Hart felt her breath catch. The station where she had first arrived stood like a ghost, the platform still scarred by memories she could not unsee. Faces turned toward them as they rode in, some curious, some indifferent, a few marked with the hard lines of judgment. Pearl Hart straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin, the cross at her throat gleaming in the pale light. She felt Eli's steady gaze settle on her, not pushing, not pulling, just there, unwavering. They dismounted near the general store, tying the horse to a post slick with melting ice. Eli offered his hand, a small, simple gesture, and Pearl Hart took it without hesitation, grounding herself in his touch. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smell of kerosene and leather and sawdust. Mr. Price, the storekeeper, glanced up from his ledger and offered a curt nod. A few other townsfolk lingered near barrels of seed and bolts of calico, their conversation dipping as Pearl Hart passed. She felt their eyes like a weight on her back, felt the way they measured her, not by who she was but by who they thought she had failed to be. And then she saw him. Martin Kane, standing near the shelves of tobacco, his hat tipped low over his brow, his mouth twisted into something that might have once been a smile but had long since soured into something uglier. For a heartbeat, the world tilted. The memory of cold rejection, the sting of humiliation, flared up like an old wound torn open. But Pearl Hart did not look away. Martin saw her then, saw the dress that no longer hung heavy with shame, saw the cross that no longer bowed her shoulders, saw the man who stood quietly at her side. His gaze flicked to Eli, measuring, weighing, dismissing. He stepped forward, the spurs on his boots clinking softly against the wooden floor. "Didn't expect to see you still hanging around," he drawled, voice oily with false charm. Pearl Hart said nothing. She did not need to. Eli shifted slightly, not aggressive, not threatening, just there, a living wall between her and anything that might wish her harm. Martin sneered, emboldened by the watching eyes. He reached out as if to touch Pearl Hart's arm, some old, bitter claim rising to the surface. Eli's hand shot out, catching Martin's wrist in a grip that spoke of mountains moved and rivers redirected. There was no violence in it, only certainty, a simple, immovable truth. Martin flinched, trying to jerk free, but Eli released him calmly, as if handling a child who had yet to understand the world's harder lessons. "You made your choice," Eli said, voice quiet but carrying. "Now let her be." Martin's face darkened, but he stepped back, pride smarting, anger simmering just beneath his skin. He turned and stalked from the store, spitting into the muddy street as he went, his retreat a small, ugly thing compared to the storm Pearl Hart had survived. The room exhaled. Conversation resumed in cautious murmurs. Mr. Price cleared his throat and began stacking tins with unnecessary vigor. Pearl Hart let out a slow, shuddering breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Eli said nothing, only offered his arm again, a silent bridge across the chasm that had tried to open beneath her. They finished their errands with quiet efficiency, gathering flour, coffee, dried beans. When they stepped back into the cold, the sun had finally broken free, washing the muddy streets in a thin, trembling light. As they rode back toward the cabin, Pearl Hart felt the last of something fall away inside her. The lingering shame, the gnawing doubt, the belief that she had been broken beyond mending. The land unfurled before them, vast and open and waiting. Weeks passed. The snow melted into rivers and streams, the earth drinking greedily after its long thirst. Green shoots broke through the dirt, tentative and trembling but alive. Pearl Hart planted a small garden behind the cabin, coaxing beans and squash and wild herbs from the stubborn soil. Eli repaired the barn roof, his shirt damp with sweat, his laughter rare but rich when it came. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon in shades of gold and crimson, Pearl Hart stood by the garden, brushing dirt from her hands. Eli approached, his steps slower than usual, a small wooden box in his hand. She turned to him, curious, heart thudding. He opened the box without ceremony, revealing a simple silver ring, the metal shaped by hand, imperfect and beautiful. He didn't kneel. Didn't make speeches. He just held it out to her, eyes steady, voice rough with something deeper than words. "I ain't offering you a grand house," he said. "Ain't offering you riches. Just a place. A life. With me." Pearl Hart felt tears sting her eyes, not from sorrow but from the sheer, blinding tenderness of it. She took the ring with trembling fingers, slipping it onto her hand, feeling it settle like it had been waiting there all along. "I ain't asking for anything else," she said, voice breaking into a smile. Eli reached out, cupping her face in his calloused hands, and kissed her. It was not the desperate, claiming kiss of a man trying to possess something. It was the kiss of a man honoring a covenant older than any church, older than any law. The stars blinked awake overhead, and the earth sighed beneath them, and somewhere deep within the sleeping woods, the first crickets of spring began to sing. They were married in the clearing behind the cabin a week later, under an arch of wildflowers and raw, open sky. No preacher, no papers, just promises spoken with hands and hearts and a faith no storm could shake. Mrs. Harper and her brood came, bringing food and laughter. The station master, his scarf still too long, brought a crooked cake. Even Mr. Price sent a jar of penny candy with a gruff note of congratulations. And when Pearl Hart stood beside Eli, the cross at her throat glinting in the sunlight, she felt whole in a way she had never known was possible. Not because he completed her, but because he saw her, every scar, every sorrow, every stubborn, shining piece, and chose her. Not despite it, but because of it. As night fell and the stars embroidered themselves across the heavens, Pearl Hart stood at the edge of the clearing, feeling the weight of her old life fall away entirely. Eli came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist, resting his forehead against hers. "You're home now," he said, the words of benediction a truth. She smiled, leaning into him, feeling the solid beat of his heart echo in her own. And she knew, with a certainty deeper than any vow, that whatever storms came, whatever winters tried to steal the light from the land, they would weather it together. For home was not built of wood or stone. It was built of hands held steady through every broken season. It was built of love that asked for nothing but the chance to endure. It was built of two souls finding shelter in each other beneath the endless, forgiving sky. And so, dear traveler, if ever you find yourself lost in a storm, remember this. There is always someone out there waiting not to change you, not to save you, but to walk beside you. If this story touched a corner of your heart, leave a word below, share your light, and tell us from where in this wide, wild world you are listening. You are part of this journey too.